In the annals of military history, the names of great generals echo through time. Alexander the Great, Caesar, Napoleon, men who commanded vast legions and transformed the destiny of nations. Yet there is a forgotten chapter, a story so improbable it defies the very logic of war. This is not a tale of armies clashing on open fields, nor of sieges that dragged on for years. This is the extraordinary account of how an army of farmers, men who wielded scythes instead of swords, who knew the rhythms of the harvest more keenly than the beat of war drums, captured alive an imperial general whose reputation had been forged in blood and conquest. Imagine, if you will, a countryside dominated by the iron fist of occupation. Imperial banners flutter over villages where families have lived for generations, now trembling under the shadow of foreign rule. The general at the heart of our story was no ordinary commander. He was a decorated veteran of countless campaigns, a man whose tactical brilliance had crushed rebellions and subdued provinces. His very name struck fear into those who dared oppose the empire. Yet, in one fateful campaign, this seemingly invincible warrior would meet his match not in another professional army, but in the callous hands and cunning minds of those he had despised, the farmers of the frontier lands. How does such an impossible turn of events occur? How do men untrained in the arts of war, lacking armor, proper weapons, and military discipline, overcome a general surrounded by elite soldiers? The answer lies not in brute force, but in something far more powerful, a profound knowledge of the land, the desperation born of oppression, and an ingenuity that transforms every tool, every path, every shadow into a weapon. Our story unfolds during a period of aggressive imperial expansion, when a powerful empire sought to extend its dominion over the fertile borderlands that defined its territory. These lands were neither rich nor strategically vital in the traditional sense, but they represented something symbolic: the complete subjugation of all peoples within the empire's declared sphere of influence. The emperor, driven by visions of absolute control and a historical legacy, dispatched one of his most trusted commanders to pacify the region and subdue its inhabitants. General Marcus Severus, as we shall call him, was a product of the imperial military machine. Born into a family of minor nobility, he rose through the ranks thanks to a combination of ruthless efficiency and tactical acumen. His campaigns in the eastern provinces had become legendary. He had broken sieges, outmaneuvered numerically superior forces, and earned a reputation for never retreating or yielding. The emperor himself had decorated Severus with the highest military honors, and his appointment to command the expedition to the borderlands was considered a mere formality, a routine operation that would culminate in yet another easy victory to add to his distinguished record. The region Severan entered was predominantly agricultural. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests and river valleys where generations of farming families had cultivated the land. They were not warriors by tradition or training. They were farmers, shepherds, and artisans who understood the rhythms of the seasons and the subtle signs of the weather. When the imperial explorers arrived, demanding submission and tribute, the farmers initially complied. They lacked a standing army, fortifications, and any apparent means of resistance. But obedience bred resentment, and resentment bred something more dangerous: a silent determination. The imperial occupation grew increasingly oppressive. Demands for tribute intensified. Soldiers quartered in family homes, consuming provisions meant to sustain communities through the winter. Young men were conscripted to serve as laborers on military construction projects. Women and children were not spared the indignities of the occupation. The farmers resisted, but beneath the veneer of submission, a transformation was taking place. In village gatherings and whispered conversations in fields far from the imperial ear, the farmers began to organize. They lacked formal leaders and a military hierarchy, but they possessed something equally valuable: an intricate communication network spanning the entire region. A word in the marketplace could reach distant valleys in a matter of days. Every farmer knew the land intimately: which paths flooded with the spring rains, where the forest grew dense enough to conceal movement, which ridges offered commanding views of the routes traversed by the Imperial Army. The catalyst for open resistance came when General Severin made a fatal miscalculation. Confident in his military superiority and disdainful of the local population, he divided his forces to seize more territory and accelerate the process of subjugation. He personally led a column of approximately 300 elite soldiers, cavalry and infantry, into the heart of the agricultural region, intending to oversee the establishment of a permanent garrison that would serve as a symbol of imperial authority. The farmers observed and learned. They watched the movements of the Imperial Army, noted its routines, and identified its vulnerabilities. Unlike professional soldiers who might have directly confronted the Severin forces, the farmers understood that conventional battle meant certain death. Instead, they began to conceive of warfare in entirely different terms, not as pitched battles, but as a campaign of attrition, deception, and manipulation of the environment. A council formed not by generals, but by those whose wisdom inspired respect in their communities. An elderly shepherd who knew every mountain pass, a miller who understood the river systems, a hunter with unparalleled knowledge of forest trails, a blacksmith whose skill could transform farming implements into weapons. These were the architects of what would become one of the most audacious military operations in history. The plan they devised was multifaceted and patient. First, they would deny the Imperial Army comfort and resources. They emptied granaries before the soldiers arrived, hiding their contents in caves and forest hideouts. Cattle were driven to remote pastures. Wells were contaminated or covered over. The farmers themselves seemed to vanish. Entire villages appeared deserted, leaving the Severin forces marching through a ghost land that offered neither provisions nor manpower. As General Severin ventured deeper into the region, frustration began to erode confidence in his command. His supply lines, which had seemed secure, became increasingly unstable. Wagons traveling back to Imperial territory arrived days late, or not at all. When investigation teams were dispatched to determine the cause, they discovered mysteriously collapsed bridges, roads blocked by fallen trees that appeared naturally occurring but were in fact carefully positioned, and narrow passes where seemingly natural rockfalls had made them impassable. The farmers waged a war of shadows. They moved at night, appearing suddenly to attack vulnerable targets before vanishing into the countryside they knew like the back of their hand. A sentry posted on the outskirts of the camp would be found unconscious at dawn, unarmed, with no trace of his attackers. Horses tethered outside a village would disappear overnight, driven off by men who could move in the dark without torches, guided by their knowledge of every stone and root. Carefully stored provisions would be found spoiled, contaminated by substances that left no obvious trace of tampering. Severin's soldiers, trained for conventional warfare, found themselves fighting an enemy they could neither see nor fight. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had faced enemy armies without flinching now jumped at the shadows. Sleep became difficult. Any sound at night could signal an attack. Discipline began to break down. Soldiers began to suspect one another, fearful that traitors in their ranks were collaborating with the invisible enemy. The general himself acknowledged the danger. He was fighting not only an insurgency, but the land itself, terrain that seemed to actively resist his presence. He ordered his forces to consolidate, reinforcing the defensive position of the dispersed units. This was precisely what the farmers had anticipated. A concentrated enemy was easier to locate, predict, and surround. The farmers intensified their campaign. They employed tactics drawn not from military manuals, but from skills honed over lifetimes of rural survival. Hunters, who understood animal behavior, applied that knowledge to human prey, interpreting signs of imperial movement and predicting where soldiers would encamp based on the terrain and water sources. Trappers adapted their techniques, creating snares and pitfalls along the routes the army was likely to use. The blacksmith worked at night, crafting caltrops, spiky devices that could incapacitate horses and foot soldiers, from scrap metal. Communication remained the farmer's greatest advantage. A system of signals, smoke by day, fire patterns by night, enabled coordination over vast distances. When the Severan column approached a particular valley, farmers as far as 50 miles away knew within hours and adjusted their operations accordingly. This distributed intelligence network meant that no imperial movement went unnoticed and no vulnerability remained unexploited. The turning point came when the farmers escalated from harassment to direct confrontation, but on terms of their own choosing. They selected a region of the countryside particularly suited to their advantage, a river valley flanked by steep, wooded hills, with a single main road winding through terrain that channeled movement. For weeks, they prepared this killing ground, transforming it into an elaborate trap. The trees were partially felled, leaving some standing but weakened so they could be quickly brought down to block escape routes. Supplies were stored in hidden locations in the hills, allowing farmers to maintain their operations without having to return to the villages. Observation posts were established on high ground, providing comprehensive surveillance of the valley. Most ingeniously, a tributary was diverted, creating an artificial swamp in an area that appeared solid, ground that would support a man on foot but trap horses and heavily armored soldiers. The farmers learned that Severan, increasingly desperate and furious at his inability to control the insurgency, was planning to march on the region's largest settlement, a trading city that served as the economic hub for the farming communities. His intention was clear. If he failed to defeat the invisible enemy, he would punish the population so severely that the resistance would collapse. It was an act of frustration, of wounded pride, and it would prove to be his fatal miscalculation. The farmers made the first move. Scouts gave warning when the Imperial column left its temporary encampment, heading for the trap that had been months in the making. Every element of the plan had been rehearsed. Men who had spent their lives avoiding conflict were now preparing for battle, armed with hunting bows, woodcutters' axes, razor-sharp sickles, and spears fashioned from tool handles. They weren't soldiers, but they possessed something soldiers often lack: the unwavering commitment born of defending home and family. The term relief in this context must be understood differently than in conventional military narratives. There was no allied army marching to rescue the peasants, nor reinforcements arriving from distant provinces. The relief came, instead, in the form of realization. The moment the peasants understood that victory was possible, that their unconventional campaign had brought an imperial general to the brink of defeat. This realization was confirmed when scouts reported on the state of Severin's forces. The once proud column was depleted, exhausted, and demoralized. Weeks of relentless harassment had worn them down, not through mass casualties, but through a steady loss of strength due to disease, wounds, desertion, and small-scale ambushes that claimed the lives of individual soldiers and small groups. Shortages of supplies meant that both men and horses were malnourished. Psychological warfare had been devastatingly effective. These were no longer the confident troops who had entered the region, but downcast men who flinched at birdsong and saw enemies in every shadow. The farmers called their final council. The hunter who had been tracking Severin's movements spoke with calm authority. He will enter the valley tomorrow at noon. He is forcing his men to go at full speed, hoping to reach the village before nightfall. He no longer scouts carefully. His men are too tired, and he is too furious. This is our moment. Dawn broke over the valley with a deceptive tranquility. The morning mist clung to the river, concealing the alterations the farmers had made to the landscape. On the slopes, hidden among the trees and rocks, hundreds of farmers waited in the positions they had occupied since nightfall. They were not arranged in military formations, but in groups according to their communities and families. Fathers with their children, neighbors who had worked in the adjacent fields now crouching, tools of their agricultural lives transformed into instruments of war. General Severin's column entered the valley almost completely broken. The cavalry rode at the head, their horses emaciated and their riders staggering with exhaustion. The infantry followed in scattered formation, their discipline maintained more by fear of their commander than by any remaining morale. Severan himself rode in the center of the column, his ornate armor still polished despite the hardships of the campaign. A gesture of defiance against his circumstances, a refusal to acknowledge that his situation had deteriorated beyond repair. The trap was triggered with devastating precision. The first signal, the cry of a hawk, perfectly imitated by the old shepherd, started the sequence. Nearly felled trees tumbled down across the road behind the column, blocking their retreat. Simultaneously, farmers on the slopes ahead released a cascade of logs they had placed high above, simple gravity weapons that rolled down the hillside, scattering horses and crushing soldiers beneath their weight. Before the Imperial forces could mount a response, arrows began to rain down, not the controlled volleys of trained archers, but a chaotic downpour from hunters who had spent their lives bringing down prey. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Soldiers raised their shields against the projectiles coming from multiple directions, finding no safe angle. Horses, terrified by the noise and the impacts, threw their riders and bolted, many straight into the prepared swamp, where they were hopelessly trapped. Severin tried to rally his forces, shouting barely audible orders amid the chaos. His tactical instinct told him to charge the slopes to bring his soldiers into direct contact with the enemy, where superior training might make the difference. But the terrain precluded this option. The slopes were too steep for effective cavalry charges, and infantry advancing uphill through the woods would be annihilated before reaching their objectives. The farmers then employed their most psychologically devastating tactic. From the hills came not war cries, but the sounds of daily life. Work songs sung during the harvest, calls to herd the cattle, even lullabies sung by mothers to their children. It was a deliberate message. They are not fighting an army. They are fighting the land itself, a people whose roots run deeper than the history of their empire. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than 2 hours, but it completely shattered the Imperial column. Soldiers who tried to flee found all routes blocked. Those who attempted to resist and fight discovered enemies appearing and disappearing like smoke, never holding a position long enough to attack. The swamp claimed the lives of dozens of men. The continuous fire of arrows and rolling logs caused the deaths of dozens more. Isolated pockets of resistance formed, but they were systematically eliminated or surrounded. General Severin, aware of the desperate nature of his situation, attempted one last escape. With a small group of his most loyal cavalry, he broke away from the column and tried to force his way through what appeared to be the weakest point in the encirclement. It was, of course, another trap. The weak point led directly to a canyon that the farmers had identified weeks earlier. As Severin and his men rode into the narrow ravine, farmers appeared behind them, sealing the entrance with a makeshift barricade of wagons and timbers. The final stand was not the glorious last battle of military legend. Severin and his remaining men, fewer than 20, dismounted in the canyon and formed a defensive circle. They were exhausted, wounded, and out of options. The farmers did not rush to attack. Instead, they waited, while voices shouted from the canyon walls. Not threats, but offers. Surrender and live. Keep fighting and die in this forgotten ravine, far from the empire that sent you here. The general's pride clashed with his survival instinct. He was a man who had forged his identity on the unwavering determination never to surrender. But he was also a soldier experienced enough to recognize utter defeat. His men looked at him, and in their eyes he saw not loyalty, but exhaustion and the will to survive. The decision, when it came, was less dramatic than historians might have expected. A simple lowering of his sword, a gesture of surrender. The farmers descended into the canyon, approaching cautiously despite the surrender. They disarmed Severin and his men efficiently, without displaying triumph or cruelty. The general himself was treated with a certain respect, not the respect due to a victorious enemy, but with the care given to something valuable and dangerous. They did not bind him with chains, but with rope, the same hemp rope used to tie sheaves of harvested grain. It was another symbolic gesture. The tools of farming had defeated the tools of war. News of General Severin's capture spread across the empire like wildfire, each account adding layers of disbelief and exaggeration. An imperial general, decorated, experienced, commanding elite troops, had been defeated and captured by farmers. The empire's propaganda machine scrambled to explain the defeat. Official accounts blamed treachery, unusual weather, disease, anything but the truth that organized resistance, even with militarily inferior forces, could defeat professional armies by fighting on familiar ground with popular support. For the farmers, victory brought no celebrations of conquest. They had not fought for glory or expansion, but for the fundamental right to live undisturbed on their ancestral lands. Severin was not held in a dungeon, but in a secure room in the miller's house, watched but not tortured. The farmers understood that their prisoner was valuable, a bargaining chip in negotiations with the empire. The empire, facing the unprecedented humiliation of losing a decorated general to those whom official records had labeled rural bandits, found itself in an untenable position. Sending another army risked repeating the Severin defeat, further damaging imperial prestige. Abandoning the general would undermine the very foundations of military loyalty. What soldier would fight knowing his empire would not rescue him from captivity? Negotiating with the farmers, people whom the imperial hierarchy considered little better than animals, amounted to recognizing them as legitimate political actors, a concession that threatened the entire structure of imperial authority. The peasants, for their part, demonstrated a political sophistication that matched their military ingenuity. They did not execute their prisoner, which would have provoked merciless reprisals. Instead, they sent envoys, respected elders with diplomatic skill, to the nearest imperial provincial capital with a carefully crafted message. They demanded not the impossible, but the reasonable, the withdrawal of the occupying forces, the cancellation of the demands for extraordinary taxes, the recognition of their traditional rights to internal self-government, and, most importantly, a guarantee against punitive reprisals. The ensuing negotiations were complex and dragged on for months. The empire, seeking to buy time while it determined its response, discovered that the farmers had not only captured a general, but had fundamentally altered the strategic calculus for the entire region. Other farming communities, inspired by the victory, launched their own resistance movements. The farmers occupying Severin had become folk heroes in the borderlands. Imperial authority, once unquestioned, now faced challenges wherever it attempted to exert its control over rural populations. General Severin himself became an unexpected participant in the negotiations. During his captivity, he had the opportunity to observe his captors closely. They treated him properly, according to the customs of war. They fed him adequately, allowed him to be dignified, and even involved him in discussions about tactics and strategy. The general, a professional soldier at heart, began to develop a grudging respect for the men who had defeated him. They had won not through luck or treachery, but through a superior understanding of their surroundings and the innovative application of unconventional tactics. In private conversations with the miller who was his chief custodian, Severin admitted what imperial pride would never allow publicly. I was defeated because I underestimated my enemy. I saw the farmers and dismissed their capabilities. I judged them by their lack of military training without considering the advantages their skills could bring in different forms of warfare. It is a lesson that should be taught in every military academies, though I suspect it never will be. Empires do not like to admit that ordinary people possess strategic wisdom. These conversations were not recorded in official histories, but they circulated as stories among farming communities, adding nuance to the narrative. The general was neither a demon nor a fool, but a man trapped by the assumptions of his culture and class. His defeat represented not only the outcome of a battle, but a fundamental truth about the nature of power. It does not stem from titles and armor, but from knowledge, determination, and the support of the community. The final resolution came almost a year after Severin's capture. The empire, having exhausted alternative strategies and facing growing unrest in its agricultural provinces, accepted terms presented as imperial clemency, but which were in reality a negotiated settlement. Severin was released in exchange for formal recognition of the autonomy of the frontier communities in local government, a reduction of tribute to pre-campaign levels, and the withdrawal of permanent occupation forces. The agreement included a face-saving clause that allowed the empire to claim it had pardoned the rebellion rather than negotiated with the rebels, a semantic distinction that preserved imperial dignity while granting the farmers substantial victories. General Severano returned to imperial service, but his career had been irrevocably altered. He was not received as a returning hero, but as an embarrassment, quietly assigned to administrative duties far from public attention. The general, who had never retired or compromised, had become living proof that imperial invincibility was a myth. He spent his final years in obscurity, though some accounts suggest he wrote extensively in private journals about his experiences, advocating for reforms in the way the empire dealt with irregular warfare and resistance movements. The farmers returned to their lives, plowing the fields, tending the livestock, raising their families. The dramatic events of the campaign faded from the collective memory, becoming stories told on winter evenings and lessons passed down through generations. They had demonstrated something profound, that ordinary people, when their fundamental security is threatened, possess extraordinary capabilities. That formal military training and expensive equipment do not guarantee victory against enemies who know the terrain and fight with the desperation of those defending their home. That ingenuity, patience, and a deep understanding of the environment can overcome sheer military might. The campaign had lasting effects far beyond the immediate region. Military theorists of later centuries would study the farmers' tactics as early examples of guerrilla warfare, even though the farmers themselves lacked a similar theoretical framework, simply doing what necessity demanded. The principle they demonstrated, that asymmetric warfare could neutralize conventional military advantages, would be rediscovered and reinvented throughout history by resistance movements confronting superior forces. Perhaps most significantly, the story survived precisely because of its improbability. In an era when military history focused almost exclusively on the exploits of generals, the campaigns of professional armies, and the grand strategies of empires, this tale of farmers defeating an imperial commander offered a different narrative, one that resonated with ordinary people across cultures and centuries. It suggested that power structures were not immutable, that the seemingly powerless possessed latent strength, and that creativity and determination could defy even the most formidable opponents. The historical record preserves the outline of events, but the deeper truth lies in what the story represents. The eternal tension between institutional power and popular resistance, between military professionalism and desperate ingenuity, between empires seeking to dominate and communities refusing to be dominated. The farmers who captured General Severan did not change the course of history in a dramatic sense. His empire survived, other campaigns were fought, and the general trajectory of political power continued. But in one valley, for an instant, they demonstrated that the supposedly inevitable could be challenged, that the powerful could be humbled, and that those considered insignificant could write their own chapter in the annals of military history. Their legacy endures not in monuments or official histories. Empires do not build memorials to their defeats, but in the collective memory of the communities that face oppression. The story has been told and retold, adapted and embellished, transformed into legend, yet retaining its essential truth, that an army of peasants, using only their courage, cunning, and a deep knowledge of their homeland, captured alive an imperial general who had assumed that his conquest would be a routine matter. In the end, the farmers asked for nothing more than what had been theirs before the arrival of the empire: the right to work their land in peace, to raise their families without interference, to live according to the customs that had sustained their communities for generations. That such modest desires required extraordinary military achievements reveals the fundamental injustice they faced. That they triumphed against overwhelming odds reveals something profound about the human capacity for resilience. The captured general returned to his empire with a tarnished reputation, but perhaps with greater wisdom. The farmers who captured him returned to their fields, certain that they had confronted imperial power and triumphed. Both groups were transformed by the encounter, though history will remember it very differently. For the empire, it was a disgrace to be diminished and forgotten. For the farmers, It became a foundational narrative of identity and community resilience. And so, the story concludes, not with the clamor of armies, but with the quiet return to everyday life. Plowed fields, harvests gathered, children learning the lessons of those extraordinary months when their grandparents became warriors not by choice, but out of necessity, and discovered within themselves abilities they never imagined they possessed. The greatest victory was not capturing a general, but demonstrating that ordinary people need not accept oppression as inevitable, that power can be resisted, and that those who fight for their home and family possess advantages that no professional army can match.